When people talk about controversial music and bands, they typically go to punk groups like the Sex Pistols, or rap groups like NWA, and there is some reason for that. The Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks was released at a time where offensive material was just completely shut down. Due to the album's name, many people were offended. Many record stores refused to stock the album, with lots also censoring it, and the police even got involved, saying they faced prosecution for indecency. NWA's Straight Outta Compton was released at a time where rampant racism and police brutality was incredibly common and blatant in American society, and because of this, many people also had problems with this album, with it taking an emphasis on being profane and violent, specifically against the police in more than one occasion. It's even told that during a concert, the FBI demanded NWA to not perform Fuck the Police due to its violent and riot-inducing lyrics. These are two albums that had widespread media coverage, but were pretty much praised as brilliant albums, apart from those who were offended by their content. But before we talk about what I personally believe is the most controversial album of all time, let's talk about the context, as this is really important to understanding the controversiality. For those who are unfamiliar, Lou Reed was a globally known artist, who's both known for his huge amount of solo work, but is also just as notable for his large contribution to the Velvet Underground. This band was formed in 1964, and their debut self-titled album released in 1967 has since gone down as one of the most influential and recognizable rock albums of all time. At the time though, this wasn't the case at all, and in fact, the album was less criticized and more just ignored. The album's content included some outlandish performances, landing in genres like art rock and proto-punk, but the experimental nature of it is blatant from the start of the album. On top of this, the topics they decide to tackle were completely against the grain during the time of its release. We might be very open and free to talk about what we want now, but in 1967, talking about sadomasochism, prostitution, and the thrills of drugs was incredibly uncommon. It's not just that most record labels wouldn't want to put this stuff out due to the controversy which could come from it, but you'd be surprised by how tame the audiences during this period wanted their entertainment. Drugs always had to be painted as bad and detrimental to someone's health, which of course has science to back it up. But if you were to even talk about how drugs in fact make you feel good and alive, you were pretty much asking to be thrown in hot water. It just so happens that Lou Reed was the primary songwriter on this album, taking inspiration from a broader range of media than your typical rock musician. For example, the lyrics in the song Venus in Furs were heavily inspired by a book of the same name, as well as dedicating the song European Sun to writer Delmore Schwartz. The topics were controversial, but it was undeniable that these artists, and more prominently Lou Reed, wasn't just doing it for the hell of it. He had something to say, and turned it into art. Underground released 4 more albums, however the final one, Squeeze, featured none of the original members. Loaded was Reed's final album with the band, leaving in 1970. However, only 2 years later, he re-emerged, performing as a solo act. Most of the content on this first album was simply unreleased material from the Velvet Underground, and was pretty much a commercial failure, but it was his second album, Transformer, that launched Reed's career to heights it had never been before. Transformer is another album you'll always see floating around any greatest albums of all time list. His songwriting on this album is some of the most compelling and brilliant in his entire career, with songs like Vicious, Satellite of Love, Perfect Day, and Walk on the Wild Side being immediate classics. The album was produced solely by David Bowie and Mick Ronson, which I think is a large part of why it's so excellent. Bowie had been a fan of Reed's music going back to the Velvet Underground, citing them as an inspiration on his album Hunky Dory. Despite all his unique and interesting output, Reed still hadn't garnered mainstream success or appeal, which would obviously change with Bowie's name now being attached to the project. It's important to note that despite this being Reed's second album, he was still very much in the mindset of making music akin to his underground days, with 4 of the songs on this album once again coming from unreleased material. If there's one thing that Lou Reed's been praised for throughout his entire career, it's his lyricism and storytelling, which was even more blatant on his next album, Berlin, released in 1973. This was a concept album about partners Jim and Caroline, once again touching on themes like drug addiction and prostitution, while this time also focusing on domestic abuse and mental health. The music was very much still in line with the consistent art rock sound which he'd adopted throughout his career, but the subject matter is some of the bleakest I've seen. It's not just the subject matter though, but how it's delivered. There's such a numbness and detachedness to Reed singing, really setting in this dour, depressive tone. And once again, fans and critics weren't receptive. Despite the commercial success success and acclaim towards Transformer, people once again didn't seem to understand where Reed was coming from, with a lot of reviews appearing mixed, and Rolling Stone claiming it was a disaster. Of course, reviews on more unconventional albums like this should always be taken with a grain of salt, with Berlin now also being seen as one of the greatest albums ever made. One live album later, and we arrive at Sally Can't Dance in 1974. This album's particularly important when discussing what I believe is his most controversial album, as it most prominently shows Reed's increasing disillusionment to the music industry. Now, this album isn't terrible, but clearly lacks some of the impact from his previous albums. It's been well documented by Reed himself and those who worked around him that his involvement on this album was much less. According to Steve Katz, the producer of this album, Reed spent most of the time in the bathroom injecting methadone and had to be propped up like a baby and have things done for him and around him. Reed himself described the production process just as negatively, saying they'd make a suggestion and I'd just say, oh, alright, I'd do vocals in one take in 20 minutes and then it was goodbye. It was produced in the slimiest way possible. Despite this, it was Reed's biggest album up to this point, still being his highest charting album in the US, landing at number 10. Fans were responsive to the album, and even more people were getting introduced to his music, although reviews at the time were once again mixed, but this time had genuine undeniable criticisms in relation to the songwriting and production. Before we touch on what I believe is the most outlandish and controversial album of all time, I think these two interviews are excellent in showing where Reed's mindset was at.
You said a little while ago that you sing mainly about drugs, is that right?
Sometimes.
Why do you do this?
Because I think the government's plotting against me.
But why do you say that?
The next big act coming into Australia is Marlene Dietrich.
Well, we have a lot in common.
Yeah, well, she's still singing. Do you think you'll be doing heroin at the age of 75 like her?
No.
You are not. I don't believe you.
Well, then stop asking.
You look a lot younger.
Yeah, what's your sign?
No. Who's that?
Nobody you know.
Doesn't travel with you?
Sure he does.
It was clear that the corporate side of the music industry had wormed its way into Reed's creative process, and as a result, he started lashing out.
Listen, I read in one interview, there's so many...
Don't believe what you read.
No, I don't, but is it
Don't
true
believe
that...
what you see.
Is it true that you wrote Sally Can't Dance in the studio?
If I say so, I guess.
But did you?
I wasn't there.
You were there.
No, I wasn't. Dougie did it.
Are you happier as a brunette?
Are you happier as a schmuck?
I'm no schmuck.
I'm no brunette.
You were blonde last time, though.
No, I wasn't.
You were.
I was a bleached blonde.
A bleached blonde.
Trashy blonde.
You looked younger as a blonde.
Well, you look older.
I'm not a blonde, though.
I know, it's worse.
He was always known for his standoffish approach, especially towards interviews. But it's in these clips where it's incredibly prominent. You've got these interviewers asking ridiculous and unrelated questions.
Lou, you sing a lot about transvestites and sadomasochism. How would you describe yourself in the light of these songs?
What does that have to do with me?
Well, could I put it bluntly, and pardon the question, are you a transvestite or a homosexual?
Sometimes.
Which one?
I don't know. What's the difference?
When Reed would rather talk about his music, or just not do it at all. So he basically just messes around with them the entire time.
Why do you think your music is so popular, Lou?
I didn't know it was popular.
You've had 2 sellouts in Sydney before you've even come here, so it is popular, apparently.
I didn't know that.
It said in your release that we were given this morning that you like lying to the press. Why is this? Now you're doing it now.
I didn't say that. The release did.
You tend to keep to yourself.
No.
Why are you attending this one, Lou?
They told me to come in here.
Is this just part of showbiz, is it? Is it necessary?
I'm not in show business.
You're not in the entertainment game?
The entertainment game? No.
Do you do everything people tell you to?
Sometimes.
Just think about that for a second. You've got a certified rock star being interviewed, and he couldn't care less about appearing likable or nice. You would never see this kind of stuff nowadays, because people are so scared about being cancelled or being popular. He proves that everything he does is for the art alone, not the money or acclaim. And then we finally land at 1975's Metal Machine Music, the most bizarre output from any established artist I've ever seen. I obviously can't play the tracks here, but if you need reminding, just listen to tracks like Walk on the Wild Side and Satellite of Love, and then listen to the first 10 seconds of Metal Machine. This is why the context is so important, and specifically the run-up to the album's release. Reed was being pushed around, being forced to make albums and forced into interviews. So when it came time to make a new one, it was basically one big fuck you to everyone. The listeners, reviewers, and the record label. As you can probably assume, this album received overwhelming disdain from all parties, being described as a 2-disc set consisting of nothing more than ear-wrecking electronic sludge. And in many ways, that's exactly what this album is. And yes, you may roll your eyes when I say this, but I love this album, and think it's an engaging listen from start to finish. The thing you've got to realise is that this album's not just pure distortion. Is it a piss take? Probably. Is it a statement? Most definitely. But there's certain motifs which crop up throughout the over hour length that make the album incredibly intriguing. Reed didn't just put a guitar against an amp and let it run for that long. Bob Ludwig mastered and engineered the album, and just to give some reference, Ludwig has won over 12 Grammys and has contributed to albums like Daft Punk's Random Access Memories and Radiohead's In Rainbows. These musicians knew exactly what they were doing, and in turn both created something incredibly polarizing, but also helped establish genres like ambient, with Brian Eno's Music for Airports coming a few years later, almost definitely being inspired by these kinds of albums. It would primarily be described as noise or drone music, and I think the only problem this album had was the audience it was being released for. Everybody hated it because they once again weren't used to this sound, and wouldn't ever want to sit through it. It's a nightmare to sit through, but it depends on your tastes, whether it'll be a nightmare that you want to turn off because it hurts your ears, or one that will completely immerse you in its dark and desolate sound. The funniest and most twisted part of this album is arguably the ending, which on the original vinyl had a locked groove, which essentially meant that the album would just keep running and running until you turned it off. You could quite literally immerse yourself in the atmosphere forever if you wanted to. I think everything about this album is pretty disturbing. You might laugh at the noise in the daytime, but listen at night and I think you'll get a little more freaked out than you'd expect. And pair that up with the various images within the vinyl, some of which appear like live performances, but others appearing incredibly distorted and bizarre, like this close-up shot of Reed, with his eyes appearing distant and shadowy, his face appearing grainy and distorted, just like the album itself. The reason this was so controversial is because at the time it was essentially Lou Reed setting fire to his career and legacy. It's not just that some people never looked at him the same way after this album, but it was of course his biggest commercial failure. Not one segment of the album could be played on radio, and it quickly became one of the most returned albums of all time, most likely with a lot of people thinking the album was actually broken, as opposed to just sounding naturally distorted. This quickly led to his record label, RCA, taking it off the shelves 3 weeks later, making the original album presses considerably rare. The only thing is, this could have been avoided. Lou Reed mentioned he had the president of RCA Records in his corner, but the plan was to release the album as a classical record, but somewhere along the line they just decided to release it as a rock and roll album instead, perhaps thinking they'll get more money that way. More than anything, I think this exposed so many people for being closed-minded, which is still prevalent today. You and I have no idea how many people this might have influenced, but the fact this is out there is a win in my book. Just look to artists like David Bowie and his Toy album, which was actively rejected from Virgin Records, and has only been released posthumously. I think every answer is right with this album in relation to how Reed wanted people to feel about it. It could have been made to intrigue, to disturb, or to downright infuriate those who bought it, and that's why I think it's not just one of the most controversial albums of all time, but also one of the most influential. It teaches people not to stay complicit with what they're being told, to not bow down to anyone's requests, and to experiment and be creative. Reed describes himself as being lucky when managing to release the album Coney Island Baby the following year, an album that was much more reminiscent of his previous work, as apparently nobody wanted to go anywhere near a studio with him after Metal Machine, and for a large part of his career, it seemed that Metal Machine was a thing of the past, an experiment that he did to polarize and potentially get out of a contract. But I think it's no mistake that some of Reed's final work stayed much more in line with the sounds of Metal Machine, which makes sense considering how one typically becomes much more reflective at the end of their life. Lou Reed died in 2013, but released Hudson River Wind Meditations in 2007, being his final solo album. This was another album filled with ambient sound, but was much more calming, due to it being created directly in association with his increasing focus on meditation and Tai Chi. He also created the creation of the universe, with the Metal Machine Trio in in 2008, and then his final album, Lulu, which was a collaboration between himself and Metallica, got quite a similar reaction to when Metal Machine was released. People hated Lulu with a passion, because fans of Metallica most likely don't like Lou Reed, and Lou Reed fans almost definitely don't like Metallica. It's not a noise or ambient album, but is more avant-garde metal, and despite liking the album myself, I think Metallica's inclusion does occasionally hinder the experience. Amazingly, with Reed actually fitting better on these tracks than James Hetfield. So, there we have it, the most controversial album of all time. I think the lengthy liner notes of this album sum up very well what the intention was behind this album, with a retaliation definitely being a big part of it, but actual musical experimentation and creativity also playing a large part. Passion, realism. Realism was the key. The records were letters. Real letters from me to certain other people, who had and still have basically no music, be it verbal or instrumental, to listen to. One of the peripheral effects typically distorted was what was to be known as heavy metal rock. In reality, it was of course diffuse, obtuse, weak, boring, and ultimately an embarrassment. This record is not for parties, dancing, background romance. This is what I meant by real rock, about real things. No one I know has listened to it all the way through, including myself. It's not meant to be. Start any place you like. Symmetry, mathematical precision, obsessive and detailed accuracy, and the vast advantage one has over modern electronic composers. They, with neither sense of time, melody, or emotion, manipulated or no, it's for a certain time and place of mind. It's the only recorded work I know of seriously done, as well as a possible gift, if one could call it that, from a part of a certain head to a few others. Most of you won't like this, and I don't blame you at all. It's not meant for you. At the very least, I made it so I had something to listen to. Certainly misunderstood, power to consume, how pathetic. An idea done respectfully, intelligently, sympathetically, and graciously, always with concentration on the first and foremost goal. For that matter, off the record, I love and adore it. I'm sorry, but not especially, if it turns you off. One record for us and it. I'd harbored hope that the intelligence that once inhabited novels or films would ingest rock. I was, perhaps, wrong. This is the reason Sally Can't Dance, your rock and roll animal. More than a decent try, but hard for us to do badly. Wrong media, unquestionably. This is not meant for the market. The agreement one makes with speed. A specific acknowledgement. A, to say the least, very limited market. Rock and roll animal makes this possible, funnily enough. The misrepresentation succeeds to the point of making possible the appearance of the progenitor, for those for whom the needle is no more than a toothbrush. Professionals, no sniffers please. Don't confuse superiority, no competition, with violence, power, or the justifications. The tacit speed agreement with self. We did not start World War I, II, or III, or the Bay of Pigs for that matter. As way of disclaimer, I'm forced to say that, due to stimulation of various centers, remember Ohm, etc., the possible negative contradictions must be pointed out. A record has to, of all things. Anyway, hypertense people, etc., possibility of epilepsy, petite mal, psychic motor disorders, etc., etc., etc. My week beats your year.